The rain came down in thin sheets, hissing against the black surface of the river as the seals crouched low in the reeds, their rifles steady, their breath slowed to the rhythm of years of training. Night swallowed the jungle around them, but through their NVGs the world glowed in gradients of ghostly green, trees arching like skeletal arms, the ripple of the current, and beyond it, the cluster of floodlights that marked the enemy compound. It was quiet except for the thrum of distant generators and the faint metallic ping of water dripping from corrugated steel. For hours they had waited in perfect silence, a silence that was not patience but discipline, the silence of predators biding their time. Each man knew what was at stake. Inside that compound were hostages, American engineers taken 3 weeks ago during a covert operation gone bad, and tonight was the last chance to extract them before they disappeared into the labyrinth of enemy territories. Their commander, Lieutenant Harrigan, adjusted his comms headset and made the silent hand gesture that moved the squad forward. The reeds parted softly as shadows shifted, boots sinking into the mud, rifles tucked tight to shoulders. They moved as if born to the darkness, men who had rehearsed every angle, every shot, every possible failure scenario until hesitation itself had been drilled out of them. But tonight felt different. The compound wasn't what they expected. Recon had said a dozen guards, maybe 15 at most. Through NVGs they now counted more than 30. Additional trucks had arrived in the last hour, each bristling with armed men, some carrying RPGs, others dragging crates of ammunition. This wasn't a holding station anymore. It was an armed fortress. Petty Officer Delgado whispered over the encrypted comms, his voice steady but edged with tension. "Lieutenant, that's double what intel gave us. They're dug in." Harrigan's jaw tightened. He knew. He had already been scanning the perimeter, noting every guard tower, every line of sight, every potential crossfire corridor. The mission parameters were slipping out of control. He had to decide, abort and live with the knowledge the hostages would vanish forever, or press forward and risk his men being shredded in a storm of automatic fire. He gave the signal to hold, crouching lower into the mud as he waited. His mind flicked through contingencies, but each one ended in unacceptable loss. The squad could flank from the east, but the razor wire stretched deeper than expected and mines were likely set along the approach. They could swim across the river and breach from the rear, but the glow of tripped lasers shimmered faintly even through the NVGs. No path was clean. The enemy had turned this place into a kill box, and any entry point meant sacrifice. Then came the voice. "Come." Controlled. A voice none of them had heard before, sliding into the encrypted comms as if it had always belonged there. "You hesitate too long, Lieutenant. They're not going to wait for you." Every SEAL froze. Eyes darted inside their NVG lenses. Comms were locked to encrypted channels, impossible to breach without direct uplink. Harrigan's throat tightened. "Identify yourself," he hissed. No response. Just the faint crackle of static and then, again that same measured tone. "Stand by. I'll clear the way." "Sir," Delgado whispered urgently, "what the hell was that?" "Somebody's piggybacking us." "Stay sharp," Harrigan snapped. He wanted to cut the line, but before he could, the night shifted. From the tree line on the far bank, a lone figure emerged, moving not with the stealth of trained operators but with a brazen, upright stride, each step deliberate. No NVGs. No helmet. Just a long dark coat that billowed slightly in the damp wind. He carried no visible rifle, only something slung at his hip, a weapon of some kind but not standard issue. He didn't even try to avoid the open floodlights. He walked straight toward the compound, straight into the beams of the guard towers. The SEALs tensed as shouts rose in the distance. Searchlights swung wildly, pinning the figure in their glare. Harrigan raised his rifle instinctively, every nerve screaming. Whoever this man was, he had just revealed himself to 30 hostile guns. Guards shouted commands in clipped bursts of a foreign tongue, rifles snapping up to their shoulders. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. The SEALs had seconds before gunfire ripped the night apart. Harrigan's finger hovered over the trigger. They could provide covering fire, they could break the standoff, but that wasn't the mission. Their objective was to breach, extract, and get out clean. Any shot fired now meant chaos before they even reached the hostages. Still they couldn't look away. The figure didn't slow, didn't raise his hands, didn't flinch under the harsh glare. He just kept walking, boots crunching through gravel as if strolling toward a meeting he was late for. The guards barked again, louder, one firing a warning burst into the ground near his feet. The earth spat dirt and sparks. Any normal man would have stopped, would have thrown himself down, begged for life. This one didn't. He kept coming. "Jesus Christ," muttered Petty Officer Klein, voice barely audible. He's suicide walking. But even suicide walks ended faster than this. The figure crossed the outer perimeter as though invisible, past the first layer of guards, and only when he reached the edge of the floodlit kill zone did he finally pause. For a moment he stood perfectly still, coat dripping rain, head tilted slightly as though listening to something beyond the reach of human ears. And then he raised his arm. It wasn't a rifle. Wasn't a pistol. It was something else, something sleek and angular that hummed faintly as light crawled across its surface. Before the SEALs could process it, before Harrigan could even issue a command, a pulse of blinding energy erupted from the device. The first guard tower exploded in a spray of sparks and molten steel. Men screamed, silhouettes thrown into the air like broken mannequins. The jungle erupted, the explosion lit up the jungle in a violent bloom of fire, the shockwave rattling through the reeds where the SEALs crouched. Shouts broke out from every corner of the compound as the enemy scrambled for cover, weapons barking erratic streams of muzzle flash into the night. The Avenger didn't flinch. He strode forward, unhurried, the strange weapon in his hand glowing with an otherworldly current. With a flick of his wrist another bolt seared across the courtyard, slamming into a munitions crate near the trucks. The blast hurled men like rag dolls, and the thunderclap rolled back across the river, drowning even the pounding rain. The SEALs couldn't move. It wasn't fear, not the kind they knew, not the controlled acceptance of risk that came with every operation. This was something else, something disorienting. Harrigan had seen insurgents with RPGs, zealots who walked into fire with suicide vests, fanatics high on adrenaline who thought themselves untouchable. This wasn't that. Whoever this man was, he walked through automatic fire without armor, without panic, and with a weapon that seemed pulled from science fiction. Bullets screamed toward him, a hail of tracer fire stitching the air, but each one deflected off a shimmer of light that rippled around his body like liquid glass. An invisible barrier. A shield of some kind. Every round spent against him was wasted metal. Delgado's voice cracked in Harrigan's headset. "Sir, what the hell are we looking at?" Harrigan swallowed, his instincts colliding with the rational part of his brain. "Focus on the objective. Do not engage. Not until I say." His tone was hard, but he felt the unease knotting in his chest. He didn't like unknowns, and this was the biggest unknown he had ever seen. The Avenger raised his weapon again. It whined, building energy like a storm charging the air, and then unleashed. A third blast lanced into a guard tower. Wood, steel, and flesh vaporized in a roaring shockwave. The compound was no longer an organized defense. It was chaos, men screaming orders, running, some firing wildly into the night, others retreating deeper inside. The floodlights stuttered as cables burned, plunging half the yard into smoking darkness. Harrigan realized, almost with disbelief, that the stranger had just opened a hole through the perimeter, exactly the breach the SEALs needed. But it wasn't part of the plan. Their intel hadn't accounted for him. Was he friend? Enemy? Some mercenary with an agenda? It didn't matter. If the hostages were still alive, this chaos was their only window. And hesitation could kill them as surely as a bullet. He clicked on the squad channel. "Team on me. Use the distraction. We're moving." "Sir, you sure?" Klein started, but Harrigan cut him off. "Move, damn it." The SEALs burst from the reeds like shadows loosed from the earth, rifles tight against their shoulders, NVGs cutting through smoke and flame. They slid into the river, water rising to their chests, weapons angled high. The current clawed at their legs, but they powered through, every stroke a rhythm beaten into them by endless drills. Across the bank, the Avenger carved another swath through enemy lines. One of the trucks mounted with a heavy gun spat fire at him, the barrel glowing with sustained bursts, but the rounds fizzled harmlessly against the translucent shield around his frame. With a twist, he pointed his weapon, and the truck detonated in a pillar of flame, hurling shrapnel across the compound. The SEALs hit the far bank and rolled into cover behind the burning wreckage. Harrigan raised his fist, halting them, eyes scanning. He could see the outline of the main building now, squat concrete reinforced with steel shutters. That was where the hostages would be. He signaled for Delgado and Klein to move left, secure overwatch. Two others flanked right. He stayed with the last man, providing center push. Their formation spread like a blade. Above them, tracer fire carved lines into the rain. Enemy shouts ricocheted across the compound, but their focus remained fixed on the unstoppable figure at the center of the chaos. It was surreal. Every instinct Harrigan possessed told him to avoid attention, to slip through shadows and strike unseen. The Avenger had turned the doctrine upside down, walking tall, drawing every eye, every bullet, so the SEALs could move like phantoms. They reached the first wall. Harrigan placed a charge against the steel shutter, pressed his men flat and whispered the countdown. 3, 2, 1. The blast cracked the air, tearing the metal wide. Smoke rolled inside, screams echoing. The SEALs stormed the breach, rifles flashing, controlled bursts dropping targets before they could react. Inside, the building smelled of damp concrete and oil, the floors slick with rainwater and blood. They cleared room by room, methodical, silent except for the occasional bark of suppressed fire. The deeper they went, the more signs appeared. Maps on tables, radios buzzing in foreign chatter, weapons stacked in crates. This wasn't just a holding point. It was a staging hub. Finally, Harrigan spotted the door reinforced with chains. He gestured, Delgado slapped a breaching charge and the steel frame shrieked as it blew inward. The room beyond was dim, lit only by a single flickering bulb. And huddled against the far wall were the hostages. 3 men, 1 woman, bound, eyes wide with terror. The engineers. Alive. The SEALs moved quickly, cutting bonds, checking pulses. You're safe, Klein muttered, though his own eyes betrayed the urgency. Harrigan keyed his comm, package secured. Repeat, package secured. He waited for the command center's acknowledgement, but static answered him. Then the stranger's voice slipped back into the net, low and steady. Get them out. The rest is mine. Harrigan froze, staring at the flickering comm light. Who the hell are you? He demanded. Silence. Then another explosion rocked the compound, dust sifting from the ceiling. The Avenger was still out there, tearing the fortress apart. Lieutenant, Delgado hissed, gripping his arm. We have to move. This place is coming down. He knew it was true. He could feel the vibrations in the walls, the building trembling under the assault. He herded the hostages forward, guiding them through the smoke-choked corridors, back toward the breach. Gunfire rattled above them, but none of it targeted their path. It was as if the Avenger's rampage carved a shield for them, every eye turned away, every enemy pinned by fear of the impossible. They burst back into the night. The compound was a burning maze, towers collapsing, trucks overturned, the rain mixing with fire into a choking steam. And at the center of it all, silhouetted against flame, the Avenger stood unyielding, weapon humming like a beast alive, each pulse sending shockwaves through steel and stone. For one heartbeat Harrigan hesitated again, staring at him. The man who had walked unafraid into certain death and emerged as destruction itself. And in that heartbeat he realized something unsettling. This mission was no longer theirs. They were passengers in a storm driven by another hand. The compound was burning down around them. Every second the night trembled with explosions, firestorms rolling out from where the Avenger's blast struck. The jungle that had seemed endless and oppressive only hours before was now a glowing wall of smoke, trees shattering as debris from towers rained down. Harrigan pressed the hostages forward, his hand locked on the shoulder of the lead engineer, forcing him to move despite the man's stumbling legs. Fear had gutted them, their faces were pale and wild-eyed, their steps clumsy. But they were alive and alive was enough. Keep your eyes down, keep moving. Harrigan barked, his voice low but firm. His men formed a living shield, Delgado and Klein ahead, the others spread left and right, rifles sweeping arcs in case any stray defenders tried to cut them off. The compound wasn't empty, men still fought, still screamed, but their attention was divided, their ranks fractured. No one could rally under the weight of the Avenger's onslaught. Another blast thundered from the center yard, throwing a truck high into the air before it landed in a twisted heap of steel. The ground shook with the impact. The hostages flinched, one of them crying out, but Harrigan yanked him forward. Don't stop, he snapped. You want to live, you move. They cut toward the southern perimeter, where the wall had been shredded by one of the earlier explosions. Through NVG's Harrigan could see an opening, jagged steel bent outward like broken ribs. It would lead them back into the jungle, back toward the river rendezvous. If they could reach it before reinforcements closed in, they might have a chance of extraction. But even as he pushed them toward the gap, his headset crackled with the voice he dreaded hearing again. Calm, measured, threaded with something inhuman. You're not alone anymore, Lieutenant. They called reinforcements. Harrigan stiffened. He glanced upward and saw them. From the far side of the compound, beyond the smoke and fire, figures emerged that weren't like the scattered, panicked defenders. These men moved with precision, heavy armor plating glinting in the flickering firelight, weapons too sleek to be black market surplus. Their formation was tight, their pace unhurried. He counted at least 20, maybe more, and every instinct told him these weren't just guards, they were elite. Delgado cursed under his breath. Sir, those aren't regulars. That's a kill team. Harrigan's jaw tightened. He knew it. And worse, they weren't aiming at the Avenger. Their eyes, cold and efficient, were sweeping the edges of the compound, searching for escape routes. They were here for the hostages. Double time. Harrigan barked. He shoved the hostages harder, forcing their stumbling legs to move. The SEALs closed ranks, each one snapping into tighter formation. Rifles rose, muzzles tracking the advancing soldiers. They had to get through the gap before those elites reached them. The air split with a scream of gunfire, not the erratic panic of before but disciplined bursts. Bullets bit into the ground near their feet, sparks dancing across wet stone. Harrigan dropped low, his rifle barking in controlled rhythm, tagging one of the armored figure's center mass. The man staggered but didn't fall, the plating absorbed the hit. Armor piercing only. Harrigan barked, switching mags. His men followed, the rhythm of their fire crisp, efficient, but the elites barely slowed. The Avenger finally turned. For the first time since he'd arrived, his path shifted away from destruction and locked onto the new arrivals. His weapon pulsed, a beam of raw energy streaking across the compound, vaporizing one armored soldier in a storm of molten shards. The rest barely flinched. Their formation shifted, shields unfolding from their gauntlets, absorbing the next blast in a glowing flare. These weren't ordinary troops, they were built to fight someone like him. Jesus, Klein muttered, his rifle cracking in rhythm. They're not even here for us. They're here for him. Doesn't matter, Harrigan snapped. We get the hostages out or this whole op's wasted. They reached the gap in the wall just as more of the armored soldiers flanked. Harrigan hurled a flashbang through the opening, the world cracking in white light and concussive thunder. He shoved the hostages through one by one, his men following. The jungle swallowed them again, damp leaves slapping against their gear, mud sucking at their boots. The roar of battle still thundered behind them, but here the night was darker, deeper, filled with the stink of smoke and rain. They pushed into the treeline, each man dragging a hostage by the arm when their legs threatened to give. Harrigan keyed his comm, "Command, this is Talon. Package secured, en route to exfil. Hostile reinforcements on site, heavy armor, unknown assets. Immediate extraction required." Static hissed back. No acknowledgement. He cursed under his breath. The storm, the interference, the chaos of the compound, everything was cutting them off. For now they were alone. Behind them, another explosion rocked the sky. The Avenger was still fighting, still holding back the tide. Harrigan didn't understand him, didn't know if he was ally, mercenary, or something stranger, but right now his rampage was the only reason they weren't dead. The elites had focused on him, buying the SEALs a corridor through the chaos. Delgado panted beside him, dragging one of the engineers. "Sir, who the hell is that guy?" Harrigan didn't answer. He didn't know. And that ignorance burned him. Operators didn't like unknowns. But he couldn't deny the truth. Without the Avenger, they'd already be corpses in the mud. They pressed deeper into the jungle, the sounds of battle dimming, though the flashes still lit the sky behind them. Harrigan pushed them harder, urging speed, his every nerve thrumming with the knowledge that the elites would break free eventually. And when they did, they would come for the hostages. 10 minutes later, they reached the extraction point, a small clearing near the riverbank concealed by canopy. Harrigan raised his beacon, flicking the infrared strobe that would guide their ride in. He could hear the faint chop of rotors in the distance, the blessed sound of salvation. His men spread into a defensive ring, rifles outward, hostages in the center. But even as hope flickered, the jungle behind them roared with new thunder. Trees snapped. The ground trembled. Something massive moved closer, not just gunfire now but the heavy tread of machines. Harrigan's stomach knotted. Reinforcements weren't on foot anymore. They had armor. The Avenger's voice ghosted through his headset again, calm even as chaos swallowed the night. "Get your people out, Lieutenant. I'll hold them." Harrigan clenched his jaw, staring into the black treeline. He wanted to demand answers, to understand who or what this man was. But the roar of rotors overhead made the decision for him. He shoved the hostages toward the sound, his men guiding them fast. The jungle behind them lit up once more, this time not with flame but with a blinding white glare, a storm of energy tearing skyward as the Avenger unleashed everything he had against the oncoming armor. The night shook with the sound of war, louder and closer, until it felt like the earth itself was splitting. And as the helicopter descended through the canopy, Harrigan knew the truth. They might get the hostages out alive, but the fight wasn't over. Whatever the Avenger was, whoever he fought against, this was only the beginning. The rotor wash churned the treetops into a violent storm, leaves and branches snapping like brittle bones as the helicopter descended into the clearing. Its side door yawned open, light spilling into the darkness, the crew chief leaning out with one hand braced on the frame, the other waving the seals forward. Harrigan felt relief wash through him like a drug, but it was laced with urgency. The thunder rolling through the jungle wasn't distant anymore, it was closing fast, the mechanical growl of engines pushing closer with every heartbeat. "Move," he barked, shoving the first hostage toward the helo. Klein and Delgado manhandled the others, practically dragging them across the mud. The crew chief's hands reached down, hauling them up, one by one into the belly of safety. The rotor blades screamed overhead, spraying rain and debris in a savage halo. The SEALs formed a defensive perimeter, rifles out, watching the tree-line. Harrigan crouched low, weapon tight, eyes sweeping. The jungle glowed sporadically with flashes, bursts of white light tearing the night apart where the Avenger fought. Each blast was followed by the metallic shriek of rending steel, the concussive thump of detonations that rattled Harrigan's teeth even from here. But the glow wasn't advancing, it was holding, a storm anchored at one point. The Avenger was making a stand. Then came the sound Harrigan had dreaded, the crunch of armored treads rolling over root and stone. Through NVGs he saw the outlines, dark, hulking shapes pressing through the foliage, turrets swiveling like hungry predators. Not makeshift technicals. Not the rusty trucks they'd torched in the compound. These were war machines, squat and heavy, their steel hides bristling with mounted guns. Whoever supplied this militia had given them tools far beyond their pay grade. Delgado muttered under his breath, "Sir, we're not getting off the ground if those roll in." He wasn't wrong. If the armor got line of sight, the helicopter would be shredded before it lifted. Harrigan keyed his calm, voice sharp. "Pilot, dust off now. We don't have time." The pilot's reply was clipped, tense. "Negative, Lieutenant. Not all your people are aboard. I don't lift until they're in." Harrigan cursed. He turned, two hostages still stumbled across the clearing, Klein hauling one practically by the collar. The man's legs had given out, and Klein's face was twisted with effort as he dragged him forward. The last hostage, a woman, staggered beside them, sobbing but moving. Seconds stretched into eternity. The armor roared closer. And then, through the chaos, the Avenger's voice slid back into Harrigan's headset. "Calm. Almost too calm. Don't waste your fire. They won't reach you." Harrigan wanted to scream at him, demand to know who he was, how he could possibly promise that. But before he could speak, the jungle ahead erupted. A column of blinding energy speared outward, punching through the first armored vehicle like it was paper. The tank ignited from within, its turret blasted skyward in a plume of molten shrapnel. The ground shook with the detonation, trees toppling like straw in the blast wave. The other armored hulks halted, their engines snarling, turrets swiveling frantically. The Avenger stepped into view then, his silhouette framed by fire. He was closer now, the rain hissing off the glowing shield that shimmered around his body. His weapon pulsed again, another lance of energy ripping into steel. The second vehicle cracked apart, its guts spilling fire. The night shook with screams and thunder. "Jesus," Klein whispered hoarsely as he shoved the final hostage toward the helicopter. "He's not even human. Get them in." Harrigan roared. The crew chief hauled the last two hostages aboard, slamming his fist twice against the door as signal. "All aboard. Let's go." The helicopter began to lift, straining against gravity, its rotors screaming louder as it clawed upward. Mud and leaves whipped into a cyclone below. Harrigan was the last to board, backing up with his rifle raised, eyes locked on the tree-line. For a heartbeat, his gaze found the Avengers, two figures in a storm, one man leaving, the other standing alone against hell itself. Then the door slammed shut and the helicopter surged skyward. Inside the cabin, the hostages huddled against the bulkhead, their faces drawn tight with shock. The SEALs checked them quickly, no serious injuries, just exhaustion and terror. Klein leaned back against the wall, sweat streaking his face, his chest heaving. "I don't even know what I just saw," he muttered. Harrigan didn't answer. He crouched near the open side door, staring down as the jungle rolled beneath them. Through gaps in the canopy, he caught flashes of the battle still raging, the Avenger unleashing streaks of raw energy, armored hulks disintegrating under his strikes. Reinforcements poured into the clearing below, dozens of soldiers, their rifles firing uselessly against the glowing shield. And through it all, the Avenger stood unbroken, his stride relentless, each blast hammering the earth with godlike fury. The helicopter banked hard, pulling away from the battlefield, the storm closing behind them. The sound of gunfire and explosions faded into distance, replaced by the steady thrum of rotors and the labored breathing of exhausted men. Only then did Harrigan feel the weight settle on him, not the weight of survival but of uncertainty. He had led his men into a mission stacked with bad intel, into a kill zone designed to crush them. By all rights they should be dead. The only reason they weren't was because of him. The Avenger, the stranger who had walked unflinching into fire and torn a fortress apart with weapons beyond their comprehension. Delgado leaned forward, his face pale in the cabin light. "Sir, what do we tell command?" "About him?" Harrigan's eyes narrowed. He thought of the voice on the comms, calm and sure, as if the man had known every step before it happened. He thought of the shield, the weapon, the way he had faced armor as though it were nothing. And he thought of the last words, that simple promise, "They won't reach you." He didn't answer immediately. The helicopter climbed higher, the jungle vanishing beneath clouds. Only when the chaos was a memory did Harrigan speak. His voice was low, heavy. "We tell them the hostages are safe. We tell them the compound is gone. And we tell them nothing else." Delgado's eyes widened. "Nothing? Sir, you saw." "I know what I saw," Harrigan snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut. "And so did you. So did all of us. But until we know what the hell he is, we don't put it in a report." "Understood." The cabin fell silent. The SEALs exchanged glances, unease in their eyes, but none of them argued. They were soldiers. They followed orders. But each man knew the truth. What they had witnessed tonight wasn't something the chain of command could explain away. Harrigan leaned back against the bulkhead, staring at the rain streaking across the open door. Below, fire still burned, staining the clouds orange. Somewhere down there the Avenger still fought. Alone. By choice. And for the first time in his career, Harrigan realized the battlefield had shifted beyond his understanding. Whatever war the Avenger was fighting, the SEALs had only glimpsed the edge of it. The flight back to base was long, an endless stretch of rotor thunder and cold wind cutting through the cabin. No one spoke much. The hostages, strapped into their seats, stared blankly at the floor, shock etched into every line of their faces. The SEALs sat opposite them, rifles propped between their knees, dripping water and sweat, their breathing slowing but never fully steady. Harrigan sat near the rear door, headset pressed against his ear, listening to static that carried no comfort. The images wouldn't leave his head. The glowing shield, the impossible weapon, the way armored steel melted like wax under its power. He had led men through firestorms, through ambushes and raids gone sideways, but nothing had ever left him feeling this powerless. Because no matter how much he tried to rationalize, nothing about tonight fit into the world he knew. The Avenger wasn't just a wild card. He was something else entirely. By the time the helicopter set down on the tarmac, dawn was bleeding across the horizon. The storm had followed them all the way, sheets of rain slashing sideways, painting the base in streaks of silver. Engines groaned as the bird powered down. Harrigan was first on his feet, ushering the hostages toward waiting medics, barking orders at his men to secure weapons and prep for immediate debrief. Inside the command tent, the air was stale and buzzing with fluorescent lights. Officers hunched over laptops and maps looked up as the SEALs entered, eyes widening with recognition. The hostages were already being escorted away, wrapped in blankets, murmuring incoherently to the medics. Harrigan stood at the front, rain dripping from his gear, his expression carved from stone. Rear Admiral Collins, their CO, stepped forward. His uniform was immaculate despite the hour, his eyes sharp with the kind of hunger only higher command carried, the hunger for results. "Lieutenant Harrigan, I need your report. Now." Harrigan glanced at his men, then back at Collins. "Hostages are secure. Compound neutralized. Mission success. Casualties? None. Not on our side." A flicker of surprise crossed the Admiral's face. "Against those numbers? And the armor? Explain." The room was quiet. Harrigan felt the weight of his men's eyes on him. He drew in a slow breath, steadying his voice. "Sir, the enemy's defense collapsed before we breached. Explosives. Secondary detonations from their own stockpiles. It took down most of their positions." Collins' gaze sharpened. "Convenient. And the armor?" "Destroyed in the chaos, sir." Harrigan's tone didn't waver, but his chest tightened. He could feel the lie like a stone lodged in his throat. Collins studied him for a long moment, then shifted his eyes to the rest of the team. None of them spoke. None betrayed him. They had already understood. The unspoken order Harrigan had given in the helicopter still stood. Whatever they had seen, it wouldn't leave this room. The Admiral finally nodded, though his expression betrayed doubt. Very well. Get your men cleaned up. Full debrief at 0900. Yes, sir. Harrigan saluted, then turned, ushering his team out. In the locker room, the silence broke. Delgado slammed his helmet onto the bench, his voice low but fierce. What the hell was that, Lieutenant? You want us to just pretend it didn't happen? Pretend we didn't watch a man walk through bullets like smoke? Klein leaned forward, rubbing his face with both hands. He's right, sir. I can't scrub it from my head. That wasn't gear, wasn't tech. It was something else. You know it. Harrigan unbuckled his vest slowly, setting it down with deliberate care. His voice was quiet when he answered. I know. But tell me, what happens if we put it in the report? You think Command's going to believe us? You think they'll let it sit on a file somewhere? No. They'll lock us down. They'll bury it. Maybe bury us with it. The room went still. They all knew he was right. Secrets didn't just vanish inside the military, they got pulled apart, hidden, controlled. Whatever the Avenger was, once his existence became official, they'd never see daylight again. Delgado exhaled hard, shaking his head. So what, we just shut up and walk away? Pretend like we didn't watch something, not human, tear a fortress apart? Harrigan's eyes lifted, hard as stone. Until we know more? Yes, we shut up. Our job was the hostages. We did it. That's the mission. Not him. Klein muttered under his breath. The mission only worked because of him. No one argued. The truth hung heavy in the stale air, undeniable and bitter. Later that morning, after showers and clean fatigues, they sat in the debrief room, answering questions that skirted the truth. The Admiral pressed, trying to pry details from them, but every answer was clipped, clinical. They described enemy troop counts, breaching maneuvers, weapons recovered. Nothing about the figure who had turned the tide. Nothing about the impossible shield or the weapon that tore steel apart. When the debrief ended, Harrigan lingered behind. Collings studied him, suspicion burning in his eyes. Lieutenant, you've been in this game long enough to know when something doesn't add up. You want to tell me what you're not saying? Harrigan's voice was calm, but each word felt like it carved his throat. No, sir. You have my report. That's all. Collings' lips pressed thin. Dismissed. Outside, Harrigan lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the damp morning air. Delgado joined him, his expression tight. Sir, I don't think this is over. It's not, Harrigan said simply. He stared across the base, where the horizon was still stained with the faint glow of smoke from the night before. He thought of the Avenger's voice, that impossible calm, and the way he had stood alone against machines built to kill armies. Harrigan had been in wars all over the world, but this was different. This was bigger. 2 nights later, his conviction proved right. They were in the barracks, lights out, when the comm system crackled to life. At first Harrigan thought it was interference. Then he recognized the voice. You kept your word. Good. Now listen carefully, Lieutenant. What you saw was a fragment. There's more coming. And when it does, you'll have to choose which side you're on. Harrigan bolted upright, his headset pressed to his ear. Who the hell are you? What do you want? Static answered him for a moment, then the voice returned, quieter now, almost a whisper. Names don't matter. Survival does. Tell your men to be ready. The real war hasn't started yet. Then the line went dead. Harrigan sat in the dark, cigarette forgotten in his hand, the weight of those words pressing down on him like a mountain. For the first time in years he felt something colder than fear. He felt inevitability, the night deepened, and the weight of silence pressed over the battlefield like a suffocating blanket. The storm of bullets had long since quieted, leaving only the faint echo of dying fire and the occasional sharp crack of settling rubble. Smoke from burning vehicles curled upward in lazy spirals, mingling with the mist that crept in from the river. The SEALs crouched in the ruins of what had once been a farmhouse, their weapons ready, but their eyes locked on the lone figure walking unhurriedly across the open ground. The Avenger. His presence had turned every assumption of the battlefield upside down. Enemies that once seemed invincible had folded like cards at his arrival. Allies who had braced for certain death now stood with renewed breath, unsure if they were witnessing a miracle or a curse. But even as he walked, straight-backed and unshaken by the threat of death, the silence whispered a single truth: the battle was not yet over. Somewhere in the shadows the enemy still lingered, waiting for their moment to strike. The SEAL commander, Reynolds, gritted his teeth and raised his binoculars. His men, battle-hardened veterans of a dozen covert operations, had been shaken to their core. Never before had they seen a man stroll through a kill zone like it was an empty hallway. The Avenger's coat, torn and darkened by soot and blood, flared slightly with every step, and his rifle swung low but steady in his hand. He wasn't rushing, wasn't hiding, wasn't even searching for cover. Instead, he walked like a man convinced that the ground itself bowed beneath his boots. "What the hell is he doing?" one of the younger SEALs hissed. Reynolds didn't answer. He didn't know. He could only watch, heart hammering in his chest, as the Avenger passed directly into the line of fire of a collapsed guard tower. Every soldier alive knew that tower had to be manned. The insurgents weren't fools. Yet not a single muzzle flash lit the shadows. Not a single shot rang out. The hesitation of their enemy was almost unnatural. And it was this unnatural stillness that made Reynolds' blood run cold. A sudden metallic groan shattered the silence. From the far ridge, a hidden hatch burst open, and with it came the roar of engines. The SEALs whipped their rifles around, and Reynolds' binoculars focused on the horror climbing into view. A mechanized vehicle, heavily armored, its turret bristling with autocannons, crawled out from beneath camouflaged netting. The insurgents had been saving their trump card. It was no ordinary armored personnel carrier, it was a hybrid war machine, a mix of captured Western tech and black market modifications. Its cannons locked directly onto the Avenger, who still walked calmly, as though unaware of the death that had taken aim at him. Reynolds' instinct screamed to yell, to shout, to order fire, but something in his gut told him to wait. Something in the Avenger's stride carried a promise that froze his voice. The turret whirred, glowing faintly as it powered up, preparing to shred the lone figure in a storm of steel. Then it happened. The Avenger stopped mid-stride, his head turning slightly toward the ridge. He lifted his rifle with a slow precision, almost ceremonial, and aimed without taking cover. The SEALs held their breath, expecting him to be torn apart by the incoming barrage. But instead of panic, there was only silence. A silence broken by the sharp crack of his shot. One bullet. Just one. The round tore through the dark, and a half-second later, the vehicle's turret exploded in a shower of sparks and flame. The machine convulsed like a dying beast before collapsing into itself, the fire consuming its belly until the entire ridge glowed like a pyre. Gasps filled the SEALs' radios, curses of disbelief mixing with ragged cheers. "Impossible," muttered one. "That's not, no one can do that." But he had. The Avenger lowered his rifle again, and without so much as a glance at the wreckage, continued walking. For the first time since the firefight began, Reynolds felt the strange burn of hope swell in his chest. Yet along with it came something darker, fear. Because this man, this Avenger, was no ordinary ally. He was a force. And forces like him were unpredictable, uncontrollable. Reynolds knew soldiers, knew their weaknesses, their strengths, their limits. But this was beyond the discipline of men. The Avenger seemed untethered to human frailty, unchained from fear or hesitation. What could compel a man to walk into death with such calm? What past could forge a soul so immune to the very instinct of survival? The commander clenched his jaw, torn between admiration and unease. War had no room for gods, only for soldiers. Yet here one walked among them, and the line between the two grew thinner with every step. The insurgents realized it too. Their hesitation broke, and from the broken rooftops and darkened windows, muzzle flashes erupted like fireflies. Bullets screamed across the open ground, tracer rounds cutting bright scars into the night. But the Avenger didn't flinch. He raised his weapon, firing in controlled bursts, each shot finding its mark with unerring precision. Enemies tumbled one by one, their attacks cut short as if death itself had chosen them. The SEALs, galvanized by the display, surged from their cover and unleashed their own volley. The battlefield roared to life once more, but this time the fear had shifted. It was the insurgents who faltered, shaken by the unrelenting advance of a man who refused to die. Smoke thickened, the air choked with the coppery scent of blood and the sharp sting of gunpowder. The SEALs moved in tight formations, flanking where the Avenger drew fire, using his impossible defiance as both shield and rallying point. Reynolds barked orders, but even as he spoke, he knew his men were no longer following him alone. Their eyes flicked toward the Avenger, their trust torn between their commander and the myth striding through chaos. That duality burned in Reynolds' chest. He had fought too long, bled too much, to surrender the authority of command to a phantom. But he could not deny the truth. The battlefield bent around this man. The insurgents weren't fighting the SEALs anymore, they were fighting him. A thunderous explosion ripped through the courtyard as an RPG streaked across the sky. The blast hurled debris into the air, collapsing walls and showering the SEALs in dirt and shrapnel. Men shouted, scrambling for cover, but through the haze Reynolds' binoculars caught sight of the Avenger. He was still standing, a silhouette in the firelight, smoke curling around him like a cloak. For a fleeting heartbeat, he looked less like a soldier and more like a specter, something carved from vengeance itself. And in that instant Reynolds understood. The Avenger wasn't just a man walking into a kill zone. He was the kill zone. The insurgents hadn't trapped him, he had trapped them. Yet even as the realization dawned, the commander knew the war wasn't won. The insurgents were desperate, cornered, and desperate men could be more dangerous than any weapon. He scanned the shadows, certain another strike was coming, something more ruthless, more devastating. And for the first time since the mission began, Reynolds prayed, not for his own life, not for his men, but for the Avenger. Because if this man fell, if this living myth was broken before their eyes, the fragile hope that had bloomed in the ruins would die with him. And without that hope, none of them would make it out alive. The ambush should have broken him, should have shattered whatever resolve he had left after crawling through the shattered city and surviving the blood-soaked gauntlet of death. But instead the Avenger moved like a man who had already walked through hell and decided he had nothing left to fear. The SEALs, though hardened operators, watched in disbelief as he stood amid the wreckage of the collapsed buildings, bleeding from multiple wounds, his rifle hanging low at his side, his chest heaving, and yet he kept moving forward with a steadiness that suggested inevitability. Gunfire hammered all around them, enemy shooters pouring from alleyways, the echoes of automatic bursts bouncing across stone walls, the scream of rockets slicing overhead, but the Avenger didn't flinch. He advanced into the storm, dragging one ruined leg with a limp that should have slowed him, but instead gave his stride a strange rhythm, like the relentless ticking of a clock counting down the last seconds before judgment. The SEAL team, pinned behind broken concrete slabs, wanted to call out, to pull him back, to stop him from walking into the kill zone that had been carefully prepared to annihilate them all, yet something in his posture held them silent. It was as if they were watching not just a man, but something larger, something elemental that had taken human shape, and it was walking with purpose toward the beating heart of the enemy's ambush. The kill zone lit up with muzzle flashes, the air shredding with tracer fire, but the Avenger didn't dive for cover. He raised his weapon only when necessary, short bursts controlled and efficient, cutting down the first row of fighters who had been waiting for him to fall. His movements weren't panicked or hurried. Each step and each shot flowed as though he had memorized the choreography of death long before he entered the battlefield. The SEALs, recovering their breath, followed his path with their scopes, stunned at how the ambush began to unravel, how men who had believed themselves in control were suddenly breaking, their carefully woven net collapsing around the single figure who refused to die. The commander of the SEALs clenched his jaw, radio static buzzing in his ear, but he couldn't bring himself to order his men forward, not yet. He knew the danger, knew the crossfire was too heavy, and charging into it would mean losing half his squad. But he also knew if the Avenger went down alone, their mission might unravel entirely, because something about this man had shifted the balance of fear on this battlefield. The enemy had been confident, their shouts of triumph echoing across the ruined street, but now panic crept into their voices as the Avenger cut through them without slowing, a shadow that bled but refused to stumble. An RPG hissed, streaking toward him, and the SEALs braced for the explosion, but the Avenger ducked at the last instant, rolling across the ground, rising with a pistol in one hand and his rifle in the other, firing both in smooth arcs that left two more shooters collapsing in the dust. Shrapnel tore his sleeve, blood slicked his knuckles, but he pressed on, entering deeper into the choke point where enemy fire overlapped in deadly precision. He should have been ripped apart. Instead, it was the ambushers who began to falter, some hesitating to fire, others shouting conflicting orders, and in those seconds of doubt the Avenger pressed forward like a phantom stitched together by rage and defiance. The SEAL commander finally barked an order, "Move up! Cover him!" and his men surged forward, unleashing disciplined bursts, their suppressed rifles cutting down silhouettes along the upper balconies and rooftops. For the first time since the ambush began, the kill zone shifted. It was no longer a trap, it was a battlefield being reclaimed inch by inch, led by a man who had chosen to walk directly into the mouth of death and spit in its face. But victory wasn't secured yet. The enemy, realizing their lines were fracturing, fell back toward the inner barricades, dragging heavy weapons into position. A machine gun opened up from a second-story window, pinning the SEALs again, rounds snapping into their cover. Grenades arced through the air, forcing them to scatter. The Avenger, now dangerously deep inside the kill zone, moved with a limp more pronounced than before, yet somehow his momentum never stopped. He slid into cover near a broken wall, his chest heaving, and for a moment the SEAL commander thought he might finally collapse. Instead, he looked back, meeting the commander's eyes across the chaos. There was no plea for help, no desperation, only a grim acknowledgement, as if to say you follow if you can, but I'm going either way. Then he was moving again, leaping from cover to cover, reloading in mid-stride, pressing the assault directly toward the machine gun nest that threatened to cut them all down. The SEALs, driven by that silent command, rallied. They laid down suppressive fire, each man moving with precision, covering lanes, cutting down exposed shooters, their training meshing with the Avengers' reckless courage in a way that made the battlefield bend to their will. Smoke and dust thickened, choking the air, but through it all the Avenger was a dark silhouette advancing with grim determination. Every enemy who tried to rise against him fell. Every trap that had been meant to stop him was broken apart by sheer defiance. And the SEALs, for the first time in the entire mission, felt something they hadn't expected to feel in this cursed place: hope. Yet hope is fragile, and the enemy, desperate to salvage their ambush, unleashed their final card. A truck roared to life at the far end of the street, headlights blazing through the smoke, its bed packed with gunners firing wildly as it barreled forward. The SEALs shouted warnings, scrambling for heavier weapons, but the Avenger didn't wait. He stepped into the open, leveling his rifle, unleashing round after round into the windshield. Bullets spiderwebbed the glass, but the truck kept coming, engine howling. The Avenger didn't move. He stood his ground, firing until his rifle clicked empty, then drew his sidearm and kept shooting, each shot measured, precise, aimed directly at the driver's outline. At the last instant, the truck swerved, the driver slumping, the vehicle smashing into a wall in a fireball that rocked the entire block. The explosion hurled the Avenger backward, debris slamming into his body, flames licking the air. For a heartbeat, the SEALs thought it was over, that the man who had carried them through the storm had finally been consumed. But then, through the smoke and fire, he rose again. Limping, bleeding, his clothes torn and blackened, he pushed himself upright, his silhouette framed by the inferno behind him. And when the enemy saw him standing there, refusing to die, their will shattered completely. Fighters dropped their weapons and fled, shouting in panic, leaving behind their dead and their wounded. The kill zone was broken. The ambush was destroyed. And the Avenger, though barely able to stand, had walked through it all as if nothing could touch him. The SEALs surged forward to secure the area, clearing the last pockets of resistance, dragging wounded comrades into safety. The commander rushed to the Avenger's side, gripping his arm to steady him, shocked by the sheer number of wounds he carried and the fact that he was still on his feet. "You should be dead," the commander muttered, half in awe, half in disbelief. The Avenger, his voice hoarse, only replied, "Not yet." Then his knees buckled, and he finally allowed himself to collapse into the arms of the men who had followed him through fire. For the SEALs, hardened warriors who had seen death claim countless lives, the moment carved itself into their memory, not just because they had survived an ambush that should have annihilated them, but because they had witnessed a man defy the very logic of battle, standing where no one else could have stood, and turning despair into survival. The kill zone had been meant to bury them all. Instead, it had become the place where legends were born. The night deepened over the valley, smoke drifting upward in thin black columns, lit faintly by the orange glow of scattered fires still smoldering from the battle. Silence followed the roar of chaos, a silence so heavy that every breath taken seemed to echo through the broken canyon. The SEALs were regrouping, battered and bloodied but alive, their bodies moving almost mechanically as adrenaline drained and exhaustion set in. Mason stood apart from them, a silhouette against the burning remnants of what had once been the stronghold of men who believed themselves untouchable. His chest heaved slowly, every inhale scraping against the weight of memory and loss, yet his eyes held none of the weariness the others showed. Instead, they burned with that steady fire, the unyielding resolve of a man who had given everything and still found himself standing when the storm passed. Around him, the valley floor was strewn with the price of vengeance. Fallen enemies, shattered vehicles, broken walls. It was victory but not triumph. It was survival painted in blood and sacrifice. The commander of the SEALs, a seasoned man named Riker, approached Mason carefully, his boots crunching against debris. He carried himself with the deliberate calm of someone who had led men through fire and darkness before, yet there was a different kind of respect in his gaze when it fell upon the Avenger. "You did what none of us thought possible," Riker said, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of truth. Mason didn't answer at first. He looked out across the devastation, his jaw tightening as though any words he might speak would only cheapen the gravity of what they had endured. Finally he exhaled and said, "I didn't come here to prove anything. I came here to finish it. For them, for all of them." His tone was not bitter, nor was it triumphant. It was a flat, cold statement of fact, as though vengeance had been both burden and duty, and now that it was done, there was no relief left to claim. The team began to prepare for extraction, their radios crackling faintly as coordinates were relayed and helicopters were summoned from the distant horizon. The sound was reassuring, almost normal, yet Mason felt detached from it all. He had walked into the kill zone not as a man with a death wish but as someone who had long ago accepted that survival was a gift he did not deserve. And yet here he stood, alive when so many had not. The firelight flickered across his features, highlighting the wear etched deep into his expression, the lines carved not by age but by grief and relentless struggle. Some of the SEALs stole glances at him as they worked, their respect mixed with an unease that came from watching a man move so deliberately into death's embrace and emerge untouched, as though fate itself had bent around him. As the minutes stretched, the valley seemed to exhale with them, the silence interrupted only by the distant chop of approaching rotors. Mason turned his gaze upward, watching the night sky ripple with the faint light of stars hidden by smoke. He thought of the men he had lost, of the comrades whose laughter still echoed in the quiet corners of his memory. For them this was supposed to be closure. But closure was an illusion. Vengeance did not heal, it only carved a path through darkness to ensure others did not follow. He understood that now more clearly than ever. When Riker stepped closer again, he asked the question none of his men dared, "What comes next for you?" Mason's eyes flickered, the faintest trace of something unspoken surfacing before it sank back into the abyss. "Next," Mason repeated almost to himself. "I keep moving. I don't stop. Men like me, we don't get to stop." The helicopters arrived in a rush of wind and dust, whipping the fires into angry sparks that danced briefly before dying in the dirt. The SEALs moved quickly, disciplined even in exhaustion, helping one another into the waiting craft. Mason walked with them, though his pace was slower, deliberate, as though each step was pulled forward not by his own will but by the momentum of survival itself. When he climbed aboard, the crew looked at him with the same mix of awe and unease the SEALs had shown. He was a man who belonged to the battlefield, carved from it, and the lines of peace and war blurred in his very presence. As the helicopters lifted into the night, the valley receded beneath them, shrinking into a scarred memory on the Earth's surface, a place that would be forgotten by the world but never by those who had bled upon its soil. The flight back to safety was long, filled with a tense quiet. Some of the SEALs tried to rest, their heads nodding as exhaustion pulled them under. Others stared blankly out the windows, lost in their own private reflections. Mason remained awake, his eyes unblinking as the darkness streamed past. In his mind, the faces of the fallen appeared and faded, a silent procession of ghosts who traveled with him. He carried them not as burdens but as guides, reminders of why he had stepped into the kill zone without hesitation. Every scar on his body, every ache in his bones, was tied to them. And though vengeance had been delivered, justice in its truest form could never be restored. Lives lost were lives gone. All that remained was the promise he had made to honor them by surviving, by fighting until his last breath. When they touched down at the base, the air was sharp and cold, carrying with it the metallic scent of oil and steel. Medical teams rushed forward to meet the SEALs, tending to wounds, ushering the weary toward safety. Mason stepped off the ramp last, his boots hitting the tarmac with a heavy finality. He felt eyes on him from every direction, soldiers, medics, even officers who had heard whispers of what had transpired. He ignored them all, his focus fixed on the horizon. Riker caught up to him, clapping a firm hand on his shoulder. "You changed something tonight," Riker said. Mason turned, his gaze steady, unflinching. "No," he replied quietly. "I didn't change anything. I just reminded them that men like us still exist." With that, he walked on, leaving Riker standing in silence, the weight of those words settling heavily in his chest. The days that followed blurred together, reports filed, operations dissected, the battle reduced to numbers and strategic analyses on glowing screens. But Mason did not linger. He stayed only long enough to ensure the SEALs he had fought alongside were recovering, and then he vanished as quietly as he had arrived. No fanfare, no farewell. Just a shadow moving back into the world, carrying his fire with him. Rumors spread in the ranks about the Avenger who had walked into the kill zone when even the SEALs had hesitated, stories that grew in myth with every telling. Some called him a ghost, others a legend. Mason knew the truth was simpler. He was a man broken by loss, kept alive by duty, and bound to a war that would never truly end. And so the Avenger disappeared into the night once more, leaving behind a battlefield scarred by fire and memory, A team of SEALs forever marked by the man who had stood unflinching where death had reigned. His story was not over, it never would be. For men like Mason there was no ending, only the endless march forward, step by step, kill zone after kill zone, until the final breath claimed him at last. The end.